Hello, folks, and welcome to another Question Time Live, now for October 2021. And as you could probably hear just now in my voice, I have a little bit of a crackle going on this morning, so hopefully that doesn't become too big of an issue. You know, I like to be energetic in these conversations, but if you are in the chat, if you are watching this, if you could let me know that the microphone is working, I always like to get a little bit of confirmation there, because frankly, if you can't hear me, there's not a lot of point of staring at this question mark or even the slides that we'll be going through for this question time without my voice. So please do let me know. Love to hear it. Otherwise, if this is your first time in Question Time Live here on the channel, this is essentially made possible by patrons of Virtual Legality, of the Hoeg Law YouTube channel. There's a tier on the Patreon that talks about being able to ask questions and post those questions to me on a monthly basis so that there is a Question Time Live episode, and that's what this is all about. So thank you very much to all the patrons that make this possible, as well as to you if you're not a patron and you're just popping in to see what it is that I might have to say on any of these questions. How we usually handle these episodes is that we are going to be taking the patron questions first. I've prepared slides to talk to you about those questions, and then after that, there will generally be some time for community question and answer. So if you are in the community and you're not in the Patreon, please, that's all right. Just when we get to that portion of the show, consider tagging me with an @Hoeg Law, or of course, you could always super chat. Please don't feel obligated to do so. Anything that really brings a color to the chat is going to get your question noticed a little bit more by me. And I say that just from historical practice now. Sometimes the chat gets moving a little bit, and it's a little bit hard for me to track. So when we get to that portion of the show, tag me with @Hoeg Law, super chats, of course, and we will answer those questions. But for now, we've got some patron questions, and I think we've got some really good ones, certainly a lot of breadth here. So the very first question is about my career as a lawyer. And the question was, what is a fond memory you have of your days as a summer associate, and what's a bad memory? And I highlighted this. I always edit just lightly just to make the questions flow a little bit better. But this was originally asked as, what are your fond or bad memories as an intern/paralegal? And I didn't highlight this to correct things just because I'm a pedantic lawyer, but because I think it's interesting to note exactly how a career in law in the United States works. So paralegal, despite having the word legal kind of in the title, is a different branch of legal services. It's not generally a person with a bar degree. You don't go from intern or paralegal to lawyer, although you certainly can. You can go to law school while you're a paralegal and move up that way. It's not the track that you just automatically go on when you come out of law school. So what generally happens, and there are a number of ways that you can go here, but if you want to work in big law or a law firm setting, then you're going to have a few summers during your law school career. Law school here in the United States, 3 years long. And so you're going to have a summer after your first year. You're going to have a summer after your second year. And the way that works is you go and you have 10 or 12 weeks at a law firm or other body, a nonprofit organization, a government office, sometimes a judge's office. And you're going to go and you're going to work as a summer associate. And when you ask the question of what is a fond memory of being a summer associate, the answer is really just about all of them. The summer associate process is, to a cynical mind, designed to make you think law firm life is awesome and fun and parties all the time. You get taken to ball games and big dinners and meet famous people and go to rallies and all this stuff that is kind of separate from the mundane day-to-day practice of drafting documents or dealing with client issues or whatever else it might be. The summer associate position is primarily a pitch from the law firm to you that you want to work there because you're going to make money and you're going to have famous friends and you're going to do all this cool stuff. And it's well known, even as a law student, that that's exactly what's happening. But admittedly, over the course of 10 weeks, you are getting paid a good chunk of money for a law student. Maybe not for a formal lawyer, but a good chunk of money for a law student. And you've got your own place. You're doing this. You got a briefcase, which is probably empty, and you're feeling good about yourself. It's easy to get sucked in to that. So a lot of fun memories, a lot of good folks that talk to you about these things, a lot of fun dinners. The bad memories are what you might expect. You're moving from a school setting. You know, me, I didn't have a professional career between all the schooling that I did. I went straight from undergraduate to law school and out into the world. And so you are getting used to what I would describe as office politics, right? Knowing exactly how to talk to people when there's a closed door meeting or you're at a lunch that was unexpected, you're going to be ambushed with something that you don't want to talk about from partners or whatever. And so there are a number of those memories that are frustrating. They're friction full. I don't know that I would describe them as bad because I think every bad experience or tough experience can be a learning one. And I like to think that I learned from every little bit of that. But I will tell you that one of the summers that I had at my law school had all sorts of kind of political trip ups and people thinking that I was getting favored treatment or not liking the brief that I did because it was too academic, which, as you probably know, if you're in virtual legality, is something that I tend to do. I like to research a lot on these issues to get to the crux of a particular point. But the actual practice of law, billing time to clients, working through those issues, is often a little bit more of a balancing act. The client wants to be 90% sure, especially if that last 10% costs another $10,000 in legal time, right? And finding that mix is part of learning to be a lawyer because you don't want to be sued for malpractice. You want to get an answer that makes sense for the client, and you want to be able to disclaim the problems that any given partial answer might have to them, and that takes time. And so I have memories of being at lunches, expecting something fun in the summer associate landscape, and being ambushed by partners telling me that they didn't like X or Y or Z. And if you are in law school, I will tell you this. You know, I've had a very successful career. I've worked at some of the biggest law firms, certainly in Michigan, one of which was one of the biggest law firms in the country. And I didn't get hired by one of the major summer associate firms that I worked for. The ideal path is you go, you summer associate, you have a great summer, you get hired at that firm, you move on with your career. Didn't get hired, didn't want me because of some of those friction points. But that doesn't stop you. Everything is just a new learning experience. And so I went out and got a number of job offers after that third year in law school. And now here we are, Hoeg Law. And of course, where all of these legal careers end up, question time on a YouTube channel, right? But thank you very much for the question. I love it. I love talking about this stuff because I think it's interesting for folks that don't go through the law school process and maybe just have experiences from Law & Order or LA Law, to really date myself, right? But I very much appreciate the question. Okay, second question, and I like this one too, more about law and how this all works. Would you take a few moments to explain how legal citations work / the backstory of legal citations? So the backstory is pretty easy. The backstory of citations is, hey, we need a way to give somebody that's looking at this quote or looking at this reference a roadmap to go how to find the actual primary source material. Because as we've talked about in this space, primary source material is better than anybody kind of interpreting it for you. You can go get your own interpretation. That includes myself, right? When you're watching a virtual legality episode, I link all those sources so that you can go look, figure out that I'm an idiot on point X, and leave a nice, pleasant, constructive comment for me on my YouTube channel. Or, you know, whatever else you might deign to do. But sources are important. That's why they're included in my videos. And so what they are is a roadmap. So these first couple references you see, so 35 USC 171, USC is the code, it's the statute, it's the federal laws of the United States. This is directing you to a specific volume and a specific section in the United States Code. This, CFR, is the Code of Federal Regulations. These will generally, but not always, be associated with a specific part of the statutory code. These are the regulations that an agency or an executive group promulgates, big legal word for the day, which is make, essentially, regulations under the authority they have given to them by law. When we were looking at things like the COPPA rules that the Federal Trade Commission puts forward, they get a law in the statute that says you will go and make regulations that will meet our needs as specified by Congress. And then they actually have to go make the regulations. They have to put them in a book. They have to go through a whole process to get approved. And some of them are stupid, as we know here in virtual legality. Some of them are good. But that's kind of how that works. So USC is the law. CFR is the regulations. And you have versions of these for every state. This 137 S Court 429 2016 is essentially a roadmap to how to find this Supreme Court decision. That's what this means. This is the volume of the Supreme Court Reporter. This is the page that it would start on. Now, as you can imagine, this had a little bit more usefulness when we were talking about going and finding things in a legal library. Now, it's mostly for posterity and so that you could look up this exact site in Google if you needed to, and you'll be directed there. Similarly, F3rd is the third federal reporter. It's similar. It's a different book. And then you talk about what court is actually saying these things. And if you're interested, you can go and find these kinds of breakdowns all over the internet. So here's the NYU law one. This is for law students primarily. But you can see, hey, what does it mean when you say U.S.? What does it mean when you say S court? That's the Supreme Court reporter. What is, FCAS, federal cases, et cetera, and talks to you about what it means. This is the volume. This is the page. This is the year. This is the court. And you also see this as a kind of official citation. You won't see me using these on my episodes very often. This is what we generally call a blue book citation. This is what they teach at law school. And one of the big things that you find out when you get out of law school is that unless you're actually filing a brief with a court that cares about exactly how these things look, if you're internally talking about these things, if you're writing a memo, then you don't need Blue Book. What you need is something that gets the reader to the place they would need to be to go and read this for themselves. And so it's close enough for the most part in the actual practice of law that doesn't relate to filing documents with a given court. That's one of the funny things, because they drill Blue Book citations into you. You have a little Blue Book, you have to go learn it, you get tested on it, all these kinds of things. Like so much of law school, it goes by the wayside a little bit when you actually start practicing. But that's what it is. That's why it appears that way when you go and you look at how I describe these things on my episodes. Is so, hey, if you want to check it out for yourself, you want to look at this, you want to look at extra context that you think I might have missed, all of that is useful. And as I like to say, if you get 3 or 4 lawyers talking about a given issue, you'll probably get 3 or 4 different opinions. That's part of what makes law fun. It's also what makes it a little bit difficult for non-lawyers to grapple with. And I certainly try to cut through that in Virtual Legality. Thank you for the question. Next, in Virtual Legality 561, you noted right to repair. If we ever get a slow news day, at this rate probably not, but whatever, would you be willing to do a video on consuls and right to repair? I think absolutely. I think right to repair is one of those interesting subjects. Virtual legality mostly functions on not doing things in isolation, on relating them to specific news items. And there are reasons for that, not just because the SEO and YouTube tends to like it, but also because when we talk about something broad, like right to repair or the right to repair movement, it tends to take on a whole number of different definitions depending on who's doing the talking. Right to repair is going to be based on a law that is passed in a given jurisdiction, and those laws can look different, right? As we've gone over when we looked at the various Epic versus Apple laws that the Coalition for App Fairness was proposing in South Korea and various states in the United States, they can have slight modifications because anything that goes through a legislative process is going to have slight differences. So right to repair as a concept, you have the right to fix whatever equipment that you've got, is pretty easy to understand. It's intuitive. It's pretty easy to get behind. Actually implementing that in a given statute tends to look a little bit worse depending on what perspective you're coming from. Does the hardware manufacturer have an obligation to give things out? Do they have an obligation to give documentation to the folks that want to repair it, to give parts, to make them available? What obligations are actually involved here? Every time you see the word right in a law, it's very often going to be compounded with obligations on the part of another. You think about right to work, you think right to repair, you think all these various references. You have to think about it from both directions, which is if the law goes into place, what should Sony or Microsoft have to do? And should they be able to have consequences? Okay, yeah, absolutely you can do this, but you lose your warranty, right? Right to repair is a little bit of a misnomer because when you have an Xbox, you 100% have the right to fix it. But that doesn't mean that there aren't consequences. Just like the right to freedom of speech could potentially get you fired. Doesn't mean that you have to stop saying whatever it is that you're saying, but it does mean that you have to live with some of the consequences. So one of the questions here is, what should those consequences be? What consequences should be forbidden? Should they have to keep their warranty if you repair it in X, Y, or Z fashion? And unfortunately, when you have a question like this, you kind of need to bounce off the specifics of what's at offer rather than just have these kinds of inchoate thoughts. Although I just gave you an entire set of inchoate thoughts. So what do I know, right? So in general, there'll be an episode in Virtual Legality when we have a law that looks like it's close to passage or whether there's a controversial kind of commentary by one or more. I know there are YouTube channels that kind of focus on this issue, and you've seen occasionally we do responses to those. And I try to only do responses if I think there's something that's kind of fundamentally misleading. I like to give everybody the benefit of the doubt on these things, but there are minute details that can be misleading. And certainly I try not to hit anything that's, not 1 million or 2 million views where I think, okay, we probably need to get in there and try to fix the conversation just a little bit. So we'll certainly see. I'm definitely following these kinds of things because I think they're interesting. I think you're likely to see more and more interesting stuff come out with respect to farm equipment, maybe hospital equipment and that kind of thing, before you get to a pure luxury good like a video game console. But it's certainly worth following. And I thank you for the question. Now we get into some personal stuff, fun stuff. What game or games would you like to see a remaster, remake, or something else of? And I think one of my biggest dreams for this has actually already come to fruition a little bit, and that's Final Fantasy VII. Although I would probably take a remaster or remake of virtually all the Final Fantasies in some form or another. You'll probably see me, if you follow me on social media, talking about the fact that I think Final Fantasy VI should be remade in the same engine as Octopath Traveler, which was clearly based on Final Fantasy VI, and that would be something to behold. But I also want to say, in general, I think we get a lot of remasters and remakes and something else's today, and I want to see more and more interesting individual experiments than just remasters. I'm going to talk about two of my favorite potential remasters in just a second, but I definitely want to see continued growth as to new ideas, new concepts, as well as refreshing old ones, because video game industry is kind of in an interesting spot, right? Actually remastering a video game is different than just colorizing a black and white movie or adding sound effects to a really, really old movie. It fundamentally changes how things go. So when we talk about a remaster, that's one thing. When we talk about a remake, when you say Final Fantasy VII 1997 edition and Final Fantasy VII remake, they are wildly different game experiences moment to moment, even though you can see the core of the story in certain respects. That's almost a different question. I'm virtually thrilled with every kind of remaster. You make it high resolution, you make it a little bit better. I love the Command & Conquer remaster, which just kind of makes it a little bit better for now. You're going to remake something. I want to know what you plan to do with it. With that said, I do have a couple of nominees for things that I would love to see remastered, one of which I think you'll know, one of which I think you won't. And that's Star Control 2. Star Control 2, you see me reference all over the place on this channel. It is probably my favorite game of all time. It is a space exploration game that was decades ahead of the open world push, kind of spearheaded by Grand Theft Auto 3 and moving into even now in 2021. And it had a sense of dynamism and freedom that seems all but impossible for the early 1990s. But it does present a barrier to entry for folks that look at screenshots like this and say, yeah, no, good try, Rick. Star Control seems like a cool thing, but I'm not so interested in playing it. Whereas Star Control 2, to me, has one of the best stories, one of the more impactful sets of choices that you can have. You feel like you are on the Starship Enterprise, exploring the galaxy, finding mysteries around every corner, dealing with resource management and fleet management and having arcade battles and all this good stuff. But this is what happens in technology. You have these barriers to entry, and I would love to see a version of Star Control 2 specifically. You did see Stardock release Star Control Origins a few years back. I thought that was a really nice game, actually, but it wasn't the story of Star Control 2, which is where I think you really have a lot to learn in game writing and game storytelling, even now in 2021, from what they put together back in the 90s, that I would love to see remade and remastered or whatever it is, to get out in front of more people now and say, hey, look, this is what you can do with an open world game. It doesn't have to be quite as static as what we've kind of gotten ourselves into here in 2021. The second game I want to mention is one that I think is a bit of a cult classic, and this would apply to the entire franchise, but it's a game called Blood Omen Legacy of Kain. Look at these graphics up here. Look at this guy. Early 3D renderings. You gotta love them. And if you aren't familiar with this game, it was essentially a kind of RPG in which you had to deal with becoming a vampire and how you were going to handle this kind of dark, nightmarish world and become more of a vampire or start to try to fight against it, which led into a much longer franchise, including games written by Amy Hennig, who's recently in the news for now working with Marvel, but famously wrote Uncharted, one of the big writers in video games, worked on this series. And like Star Control, you know, it looks like this. You have a little trouble grappling with it. It uses some of those early kind of PlayStation. I actually played this on the PlayStation graphics where everything kind of pops out a little bit. But again, as someone that loves narrative, loves storytelling, I hate to see great stories kind of fall by the wayside just because their graphics look like this now. I would love to see them brought up to some kind of pacing, because you shouldn't lose those stories. You shouldn't lose those experiences, because that is still decades ahead of where it should have been when this game was released, and still I think would be very, very approachable as a story for people in 2021. So I would love to see these kinds of games and other games that have really good narratives, really good stories, really impactful stories come out in a way that people in 2021 can accept for their graphical stylings. All right, thank you for that question. How can AI help improve your work or the work of someone else in your field? Can AI be smarter, perhaps close to what we see in sci-fi, and not what we have right now? So I will tell you this, the phrase AI makes the blood run cold in many, many partners' offices across the legal field. Because for a number of years now, and this is kind of the way of technology and futurism, right? There have been reports that AI is going to replace every bit of the legal practice. And I do think there is definitely a place for artificial intelligence, systematic programming of things like contracts, right? If you go and you look at my series on the Raw Fury Publishing Agreement, you will see certain rubrics that I explain as to how you should think about this particular kind of term or this kind of term, or how indemnification works and these kinds of things that you can have built into an artificial intelligence that can make these decisions and pop out a kind of early stage red flag, yellow flag report on a contract, which will, yes, take away billable hours at the front end from a legal representation, but one, it will get better legal services to more people, and it will allow you to do more things on detailed parts of the contract, skipping some of the stuff that you know you're going to do. So what would be a 3-hour review for someone like me might become an hour and a half. That gets more people better contracts, and hopefully more people with better, more economical relationships. Of course, that does mean maybe my revenue or the other big law firms' revenue goes down a little bit as they try to deal with this kind of movement. Change is scary for every industry, but I love this stuff. I love more people being able to engage with these really important legal questions. This is probably what you could have already guessed from the fact that I have this YouTube channel, and I try to put out information about news items that I think are either misreported or could have a little bit more detail added to them. So I look at AI and say, yeah, it's going to be a part of the legal field in the short term. And I'm certainly always looking into how I'm going to integrate that into my practice of law. And the solutions aren't perfect just yet. I don't even think they will be the kind of solutions that just have a robot lawyer working on your contracts or your litigations or anything else like that. I think you're going to have a set of AI solutions that get you maybe halfway there, and then you can jump off from there and have even better legal services from an inhuman flesh and blood lawyer that takes you across the finish line. And some of that you can already see with some of the online services, your Legal Zooms and what have you, where you can do really rote stuff pretty easily. And I always tell clients, hey, if you want to do this rote thing, you don't need to pay me for this. Go do that. You can do a separate filing with the state for this. It's a one-page document. I want to give value to my clients. But when you get some of those LegalZoom documents, when you get something that's been AI reviewed, there's generally always a place where you say, well, every situation is novel. There is difference here. There is value that I can add to the proposition. And I do think some lawyers are just a little bit skittish about change because they're skittish about change. Generally speaking, you don't become a big firm lawyer if you don't have a certain amount of aversity to risk. And that is shown pretty well when we start talking about artificial intelligence. Thank you for the question. And finally, to finish off with our patron questions, a little seasonal treat here. What was or is your favorite treat to get when trick-or-treating? I like the is there. I like the concept that the question was posed on the premise that I still might be trick-or-treating. First of all, I think if that were societally acceptable, I might be. I think it's a fun process. I like to meet neighbors and have those conversations, but I'm not. I do have my 2 daughters, and they go trick-or-treating, although this is a year where I think they're going to be going with their friends instead of their dad. So it's an interesting year for me on that. What was your favorite treat to get when trick-or-treating? I actually have the best, fondest memory of living in a neighborhood here in Michigan and shuttling over to, the rich folks' neighborhood. I think everybody has one of these. You go over to where they give out the whole candy bars and things like that. And there was a gentleman in that neighborhood that was a splash page artist for one of the big comic book stores or comic book houses. I want to say it was Dark Horse, but don't quote me on that. I don't know how you check on it, but don't quote me on that. And he would give out like giant splash pages, filled your entire trick-or-treat bag, glossy, to the people that went over to his house. And I always thought that was super cool. I was never big into actually reading them, comic books, that is, but actually getting one of these glossy pages that was done by a real artist, they're so kind of spectacular in person in that format. That it was like getting a piece of art. And that was always super fun. Obviously, a lot of blends together, right? Even when you're getting full candy bars, which is pretty cool. Those are all kind of going together. Those comic book pages, I definitely remember. I got 2 or 3 years of those. And I thought that was really fantastic. What is my favorite to give? Well, on that same score, I always loved showing up and getting kind of big amounts of candy from folks. I love to give big amounts of candy. I like to wow them. Unfortunately, just the way my house is situated, we don't get a ton of trick-or-treaters, generally speaking. So if I have a bowl of minis or if I have big candy bars, I usually like to hand them and say, take what you feel. Take what you think is appropriate. You get 2 Snickers bars or have a big old armful of the bowl. I like to feel generous in the process of Halloween, and I think that the kids deserve it. So that's what I really like to do. I don't know that I have a specific candy other than the fact that I tend to go more towards, the fruity flavors, the Sour Patch, the Skittles, the Starburst than I do over the chocolate. So my wife and I work out well because she loves the chocolate more than I. But I love finishing off with a Halloween-related question from the patrons. Again, thank you so much to all of them who support the channel. We couldn't do this without you. That's why these episodes exist in question time. And now we're going to turn it over to the community. So as I said about a half hour ago, if you do have a question, you want to ask a question, if you could flag it with an @Hoeg Law, if you could otherwise, put a super chat if you're so inclined. Please don't feel obligated to do so. I will see those a little bit better, and I can answer those questions. So we're open to the community. I will look out for those flags in the chat. For right now, we can talk about some things that I liked about this month as we go forward and look for those questions. Certainly, in terms of things that I'm personally enjoying, you might have seen I did a postmortem for the first time in a long while. I'm a big, big, big fan of the novel Dune, and I did a postmortem because I think it's one of the best movies of the year. Doesn't mean it's perfect. In fact, if you were to somehow itemize what I have to say in that postmortem, it's probably 80% criticism. But as I say, even in that video, it's because I criticize the stuff that I love, the stuff that I really think was close to perfection, close to greatness. And I think Dune is very, very close to greatness, but still kind of stumbles in a few places. If you got HBO Max, couldn't recommend it more. If you want to pop over to a theater, I absolutely love it. So please do check it out. I think I've watched it 4 times now in the week that I've had it available to me on HBO Max. I think it is great to see a non-MCU, non-video game, non-property movie with this much money and vision and really skill put into it. And yes, Dune, very old book series franchise, definitely a kind of brand. It seems like that's the only thing that movie makers will make nowadays, but it's not quite in the same vein as all the MCU movies, which, by the way, I like. But that I think have been sucking the oxygen out of the room a little bit. So please do check out that one. On other stuff that I really like, one, I wanted to give a thank you to our first 100,000 view video of the year, which was licensing lessons with Sora, Smash Brothers, Disney, and more. You all really love Sora. You all really love Disney. I love it. And I'm very thankful to everybody that checked out this video talking about what amounts to licensing issues and how copyright and trademark works and who owns what and how these little marks work in the corner and how much I miss Goofy and Donald from the stained glass window that they added to Smash Brothers. But certainly a lot of people had a lot of thoughts on that. Thank you so much for checking that out. That was really cool. And I do have a question I will accept at Hoeg Law. I think that's pretty good. That would make a pretty good Halloween costume, I think. Do you think it is possible that a big industry giant like Amazon or Apple might acquire Sony, especially in this consolidation phase? I never say never to anything, especially when we're talking about the tech giant companies right now. But I will say when you're having these kind of dream scenarios, companies that are a little bit more conglomerate themselves, that don't just act within one specific industry, are a little harder to make work from a financial perspective. There's a little bit more convincing. There's a little bit more that needs to go into that diligence process to understand how they're going to integrate with what it is that you do. So Sony has a fairly broad footprint with what it does. You can put it under the ambit of electronics, but it does a little bit more than some of the other companies that you're seeing purchased, even in this consolidation phase. Certainly something like a company that just makes games, even Bethesda just makes games, ZeniMax. So you're talking, when you talk about Sony, about more. And if that does happen, there have to be plans for what you're going to spin off, what you're going to keep, what's going to be redundant to what you do. So I think when you start talking about those companies, it's a little bit more unlikely. Definitely doesn't mean it's impossible. We've seen huge acquisitions and huge mergers. But when you're thinking about your fantasy football teams and you're figuring out who's going to buy what, I wouldn't say that it's extraordinarily likely that they're going to jump into a company that makes TVs and Sony PlayStations and movies and more. So that I would say is a little bit unlikely. But thank you for the question. The other things that I wanted to point out here, outside of Dune, which I, again, highly recommend, is I wanted to flag a couple of games that I've really, really enjoyed. Actually, both from Square Enix this month, because they're weird and because I don't know exactly how much credit they're getting out there and whether or not you would actually like them. So these are not recommendations that are made because I think everybody on Earth would like these games, but because I do. And I think it's worthwhile to talk about them. If you've seen this, start your survey for Square Enix. No, thank you, Square. There's a game called Dungeon Encounters, which is, in my opinion, one of the best games that I've played this year. Certainly something that has kept me engaged the longest. I've already played this for about a dozen hours. But if you look at it, it doesn't attract really anybody to play it. On these screens, you basically see how the game always looks. You're basically Pac-Man filling in these boxes. These numbers represent things. Represent either events or stores or other things that you're going to engage with. If they're white, they're good. If they're black, they're enemy encounters that look like this, which is essentially just these two sets of boxes bouncing off of each other. But why? But in that context, what you have is an amazing number of systems. They have a physical defense, a magic defense, and health points. Your weapons hit one or the other of those. They can be deterministic. They can be hitting a specific number of damage, or they can be random. So you're taking kind of a lottery ticket with those. And every single set of enemies kind of does different things. You're constantly engaging with what to change and what not. And there's 100 levels of this. And it might look like it's procedurally generated. It's not. It's handmade. So you learn to figure out how the levels work in a fashion that if you just like a really good battle system and just engaging with something almost on a purely intellectual basis, it's almost like playing Sudoku or something like that. I highly recommend it. I think it's only $20. I love this one. And on the same vein, I think that another game that Square Enix just released is kind of similar in being weird. This is called Voice of Cards, The Isle Dragon Roars. And this is a game that's made entirely out of cards. So if you go and you want to explore the world, it looks like this. It's a set of cards. Here's the ocean and you walking around, and here's some forests, and here are these cards. And it's done with narration. One narrator talking through all voices, so it winds up feeling like you're in a very personalized kind of Dungeons and Dragons scenario with cool art, fantastic music. I think the creative director is Yoko Taro from Nier fame, and it's very engaging. And so I find myself just drawn to these super weird kind of games from Square Enix, but I'm super thrilled that they are deigning to make these kinds of things. So I did want to get those out. I always like to talk about what I'm into this month and what I'm playing. So if you haven't seen these, Dungeon Encounters, Voice of Cards, The Isle Dragon Roars really have been fantastic. I also really love Guardians of the Galaxy, by the way, but that's a little bit more standard. I think that gets enough press. Thank you, Christina Nardone, for a super chat. That is very generous of you with a question. What are your thoughts on CDPR acquiring the gaming studio, The Molasses Flood? I cannot tell you exactly what the CDPR plan is. I think it's certainly good for them to take into account that it appears that they aren't set up for success, right? You've seen this in the last, I guess it's almost a year now, since they released Cyberpunk 2077, where they started talking to their investors and their shareholders and the public about how they wanted to diversify more. They wanted to stop throwing their entire company at one thing and to not just be the Witcher and now Cyberpunk company. And so I think those acquisitions make sense for, hey, we want to make sure that we have more bodies that we can put on more things to increase the basket of goods that we're selling, because we realize that even though Cyberpunk sold 15 million copies, even though it was one of our most profitable years ever, it clearly burned goodwill, and we shouldn't have our entire livelihood and the success of what is a publicly traded company depend on not screwing up a major release like we did with Cyberpunk, because essentially it burned a year. Right? If you look at what they've done this year, it's been trying to fix Cyberpunk, and they've missed their windows for their next-gen re-release of Witcher 3, their next-gen upgrade for Cyberpunk 2077, the DLC expansion packs for Cyberpunk that would have made money and revenue for the company. They essentially exploded a year of their revenues because of the mistakes that were made, and the knowledge that they know they have to fix it. So I think those acquisitions are worth following, because I think they're being smart about the fact that they have to broaden their horizons. Thank you for the question. Oh, and another one. Thank you again, Christina Nardone. What are your thoughts on DRM nowadays? That's digital rights management to you and I. It's funny. You hear me talk a lot about trademarks and copyright and intellectual property in this space. And I think that there are worthwhile reasons for a copyright holder, an intellectual property holder, to want to try to protect what it's got. And that piracy is a concern for all sorts of software. Certainly, we've had a conversation about emulation very recently. But at the end of the day, I think that these companies need to be a little bit more cautious about DRM and solutions that actually impact the enjoyment for somebody that's paying for the product. That if you're using CPU cycles to have that engaged to protect the copyright holder, that feels bad to the person that otherwise paid $20 or $30 or $60 to that copyright holder. So I would like to see a continued push for, I think digital rights management is something that maybe isn't as necessary as these copyright holders think it is. But if it's going to be something that, for whatever reason, your accounting department, your legal department thinks, hey, we really need to have this in here, maybe even because investors are asking for it and we want to be protected and be able to tell them that we're taking steps, there needs to be a solution that is as invisible as possible to the actual consumer end state. And I think maybe we're moving towards that. Sometimes it feels like we're taking a step back, but that's what I'd like to continue to see. I don't think it's going to go away from a lot of these big holders, although I think, like I said, it's probably a little bit less necessary than they think it is, but certainly it can be less impactful in a number of cases. Thank you very much for the question. And I do have a couple of flags here. One, at Hoeg Law, the California versus Activision lawsuit. What happens now after that entire turnabout? I like that. Is that a deliberate Ace Attorney reference? I like that. I don't think I've seen the word turnabout outside of Ace Attorney. How far away are we for the conclusion of the next step? Okay, next step in California versus Activision is an Activision response document to the California complaint, outside of some craziness. You never want to say there couldn't be an emergency motion by somebody being absolutely crazy, and I can't anticipate it. But right now, California filed its lawsuit over the summer. Activision actually hasn't responded with a document. There's been some extensions. They say they're not going to file an answer. They're going to file what we call in the law a demurrer, which is going to essentially complain about the way California wrote some of its complaints. And Activision had until October 22nd to file that. Now, you might note on your calendar, it's actually October 30th right now, a little bit after that. But what appears to have happened is that Activision started fighting about the ethics complaint side of things once the EEOC made that apparent. That got into a little bit of an emergency tussle, and my best guess is that they were given a short extension on which they could file their next document in that case. So we're waiting for that. If it's just a demurrer, I may or may not cover it on the channel because it's going to be something technical and may not be that big. I hesitate to say that. It could be enormous. But if it's just a simple demurrer, that's essentially another move to get Activision to have California correct its complaint and then to move their answer period further and further and further. So you could be waiting for an Activision answer until late November. It's unclear to me. A lot of those documents and a lot of those conversations in the court don't get publicly filed, so we don't see all the specifics there. But certainly, we would hope Activision would have to answer this thing before the end of the year. But they're certainly taking all steps that you would expect from a law firm to try to move things back. as much as they can. So thank you for the question. I think that's what we're waiting for next. On the other side of things, the EEOC settlement technically hasn't been formally intervened by California yet. We'd also be looking to see if California decides to take that step or just lets it ride after the EEOC showed what guns it is prepared to bear at the state. So we're watching that as well. At Hoeg Law, thoughts on Facebook rebrand to Meta? My first thought is I called it. You can check my Twitter. More for PR purposes versus reducing the heat from the legislative side. If they think that they can reduce heat from the government based on a name change, they are wrong. They might get a difference in the court of public opinion if they really leaned on that Meta name. I think for the most part, it's going to be the same as Alphabet, right? Does anybody use Alphabet to describe the Google companies? I don't think that they do. It's just designed to give a holding company a different name from the product. And the interesting thing about that is if you were to sit down with me across the desk in my office and say, hey, we're going to start a company, we got this product, one of the pieces of advice that I would give you is, in general, you don't want your company to have the same name as your product because you don't know when the product's name will need to be changed. You don't know whether you're going to branch out into other products. You don't want that consistent identity between your corporate entity and the thing that you're selling into the public. So Meta and Facebook, or whatever, and Facebook as a product always made sense to me. You don't generally want to have that same identity. And Meta allows them to have Facebook to make a different product entirely, potentially spin that off, and not have some of the, Facebook papers detritus on them when they're otherwise operating in a business capacity. Everybody knows that Alphabet owns the Google companies. Everybody knows that Meta owns the Facebook companies. But there is at least a small psychological distinction, especially when you start talking about journalism and reporting. And you saw that just this week. Like, this changes nothing. And Mark Zuckerberg talking about things that Tim Sweeney has been talking about for 2 years, sounding a little bit crazy himself, and getting all of that coverage is the power of Facebook. It's journalism. I don't think it's a significant change, but when Mark Zuckerberg does something, it makes more news than it otherwise does. So who am I to say whether or not they're right in that? I do think from a legislative perspective, regulatory bodies, governments, they don't care what it's called. If they're going to legislate social media, they're going to hit you regardless of whether your name is Meta, Verse, or anything else. Let's see here. Man, I wish Squeenix wasn't greedy in regional pricing in my country. I wanted to buy the card game day one. Yeah, I always look at regional pricing and say, what are you doing with some of that stuff? So I hear you. I really do like the card game. So if you can get it on sale, I think it's going to be a shorter one just based on my progression and the trophies, maybe a dozen hours. So you can check it out. But definitely, I've enjoyed it. I think the art is beautiful, and I love seeing folks try different ideas. I just do. Let's see. Hopefully CDPR gets out of the rut with this move. They need it. Yeah, I agree. I think so. They need to shake things up. I think they're in the process of doing that. And yes, games like RE Village and Deathloop got a lot of flack for including de novo in their games. Right. And that's what I think you really should be watching if you're a copyright holder. Yes, protect what you can. We understand that even in your back offices, you're going to be getting pressure from the professionals that maybe you don't even play video games about this kind of stuff. But definitely try to make sure it doesn't actually affect the gameplay experience. Also, why aren't you excited for the WB Fighter multiverses? Is this coming from my social media? I don't think I've mentioned it on this video. Dune Kid versus LeBron James versus Casablanca Man versus Sub-Zero. Sounds like a funny idea. Are you not interested in Warner Brothers or Smash-like games? Yeah, so I'm going to hold off on true judgment until we actually see the game announced and what it looks like. I think there is an area for these games and even kind of bargain basement versions of these games like the Nickelodeon one to work. I am not as enthused by some of the shots that were leaked from this game because I think that the Warner Brothers stable of intellectual property is weird. Paul Atreides versus LeBron James. Yeah, okay. That's weird. But it's not compelling to me outside of what I think would be the novelty of the uniqueness. Further, just from the shots that have leaked, I think that for that game, what you should do is you should lean into the conflict, the differences of what all of those things are. Dune should be super serious and desaturated. Rick and Morty should be crazy and cartoony. Gandalf coming in should be, textured and serious, maybe of a similar vein to Dune, but slightly different. And what they appear to have done is said, oh, we've got all these IPs, let's just unify them. Let's make, whoever, Gandalf or Neo from The Matrix or Bugs Bunny basically have the same art style. And that, to me, that's not where the fun lives, right? That's not where any of that should go. That said, all of that could be wrong. Could be the coolest thing ever. We'll take a look at it. I just tend to think that the WB's ownership, outside of DC, which I think is going to work really well with the video game side, and Mortal Kombat, where we note that there's a DC and Mortal Kombat fighting game already, is just not as valuable as they think it is on a broad kind of 4 quadrants perspective. They aren't Nintendo. They aren't Disney. They're kind of a little bit less than. So I'm not excited about it because I'm not excited. I can't change how I feel about it, but I'm always open to being convinced. Let's see. What happens to copyright if a company that has it goes out of business and then, for example, no company wants to buy its assets? Yeah, so we get into orphan works, right? How do we figure out who owns something? And the answer is they can get really, really messy. If you lose track of that, if you don't know where the portfolio lives, especially if they're split portfolios, somebody has development rights, somebody has publishing rights. If you get into music, that can get really wacky. It becomes a problem. Things get effectively locked up. It's one of the reasons why, we're on whatever, episode 560 something here. You'll see in a video that I've done before, I've said we really should think about having something like a copyright clearinghouse, right? If real property gets lost, places on this earth in the United States, and we don't know where the deed is, we don't know who the rightful owner is, there's a clearinghouse process in most jurisdictions that allows you to essentially put it up, say, hey, make your claims. If nobody makes a claims, we're going to auction this off, and we're going to get this owned. We want productive use out of these things. Real property, obviously, a limited resource, so we don't want it to just go stale. I would love to see a similar concept in intellectual property that essentially is a clearinghouse. I would love to see a remake, speaking of earlier questions in this video, of a game called No One Lives Forever, which has just died because there's 600 owners and nobody knows what's going to happen. And you don't want to make that remake because if it is successful and it's making money, well, that's when everybody that might have a right to that game come out of the woodwork. I would prefer to have them have to do that before the resources are spent, before the bet is made, and say, hey, if you've got a claim, say your piece now, and we'll sort this out so that somebody can figure out what licenses are needed, what contracts are needed to go forward with this. And I really do think that kind of clearinghouse process would be a fantastic addition to intellectual property. And I can't pretend to have thought through all of the details there. That's a multi-year process of really working through what that would look like. But I think that kind of thing would massively help orphan works and the situations that you describe and get more good products out to more people that want them. Are you planning to, or have you tried Age of Empires 4? So I have not downloaded it yet. I love Age of Empires, and Age of Empires 2 and Age of Mythology are two of my favorite RTSs of all time. I haven't downloaded it yet because I'm pretty certain that my computer would die. I don't know that for certain, but certainly modern RTSs make my computer groan. It's good enough for practicing law. It's not necessarily good enough for however many processor cores they want to move the little people around. I probably will download it just to confirm for myself that fact, and maybe work with it on a Steam Deck or something else. God knows if it works over there. But I'm very excited about it. I'm the kind of guy that looks at the stuff in the reviews about documentaries with augmented reality, little people moving over hills and things, and says, that's what I want out of my RTSs. I want to see how that looks. But for right now, have not downloaded it yet. It's been a week. If you've been following the channel this closely, good for you. But you may have noticed that a lot of the videos this week came out late in the day. Generally speaking, that's me having a ton of work on deadline and clients to handle and legal matters to discuss, as well as appearances and things. Stay tuned. There'll be some appearances for me in some big places in November. That working through all of those meant that the videos were coming after the rest of my workday. So it's just been a week. Haven't really gotten to it yet. Mostly been playing Voice of Cards and Guardians of the Galaxy in the very late hours after work day. But thank you for the question. I'm asking this because Warner has been sold off since its inception. It is weird, don't you agree? My question is, why do you think they keep selling the company, and when could they stand on their own? Well, I mean, they're selling parts of the company because their parent company has a massive debt problem. And so they're trying to spin off things to potential buyers in the most efficient, most economical way possible. If you think about auctions, or if you've watched even an auction HGTV show or something along those lines, there are experts and financial folks at companies like Warner Brothers and AT&T and Time Warner and all these other places that go and evaluate exactly how best to package things to try to maximize the amount of money that the seller can get. And that's what I think you see with Warner Brothers. And they aren't interested in selling their assets, which they think are valuable, and I think justifiably so, for an amount less than X. You know, they have an internal reserve price if you're thinking about eBay or other auctions. And they don't want to sell it for less than a certain amount, and they can prove that it's worth more by making this game or that game or doing whatever it is that they're going to do with it. So I think you're going to continue to see a kind of breakup and recombination of those assets because they weren't being served very well in the fashion that they were in. But I wouldn't expect Warner Brothers to just dissolve or anything like that as we go forward. Hype check for Eternals. Zero-ish? I'm not against it. But the MCU, really after Far From Home, really took a backseat for me. Certainly tried WandaVision, tried the Disney Plus shows. If you've been in this space, you know they mostly didn't work for me. Falcon versus Winter Soldier being the worst. And with that, I haven't seen Shang-Chi, so I'm going to check that out. I think it comes out on Disney Plus next month. But it just hasn't been that exciting of a time for Marvel. So I guess there is a small amount of hype for me for doing something different. But then the reviews came out and said it didn't do something different. So I'll see it when I see it, but I'm certainly not super excited for it. We will see how it goes. And then No One Lives Forever. A lot of people want No One Lives Forever on GOG nowadays, according to the community wish list. Yeah, it's a fantastic game, but the IP is an absolute mess. So I think that's it. It's 10:52 here in the East. If you got any other quick questions, drop them in. But I do want to say thank you to everybody for showing up at this question time, for the patrons, make this possible, for all the great questions we got, certainly from the patrons and from the community, and for everybody that makes this channel work. I couldn't be more thankful for the growth and for being able to talk about Sora and Smash Brothers to 100,000 people. I continue to be floored that we can have these conversations. People can be interested in these kinds of things. I am very, very thankful to all of you, and have a great Halloween. With that, I think I'm going to end the stream. Go Blue, beat Sparty. We'll see how it goes. We'll talk about it as I lick my wounds after a tough November for Michigan, if that's what happens next month. Otherwise, have a great one, and I will catch you on the next episode of Virtual Legality.